We're going to begin in Beijing, a high-stakes summit between China and the European Union. President Xi Jinping meeting with the European Council President Antonio Costa and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. They discussed a wide range of issues that include a simmering trade dispute. Xi calling on both sides to work together while properly managing their differences. Von der Leyen described the talks as excellent. However, she said trade imbalances need to be addressed with urgency. Okay, joining us now to talk about the state of China-EU relations is Klaus Larres. He is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Klaus, good to see you again.
Good evening. How are you doing?
Good, good, good. A half a century of diplomatic ties. Let's talk about what's at stake in the talks in Beijing. Commerce, trade, and of course, the ongoing fighting in Ukraine among the chief topics going on in Beijing between China and EU nations.
Yeah, there's been a lot of tension recently between the EU and China. It was an anniversary summit, the 50th anniversary summit, but there wasn't really much to celebrate because tension and friction was everywhere, and both sides tried their best to paper over some of these tensions, but it couldn't be overlooked. You know, the summit was meant to be for over 2 days, last over 2 days. It was whittled down to 1 day, and a preparatory meeting before the summit had even been cancelled. There had also been talk that the summit itself would be cancelled or postponed,
wow.
But as we saw, this was not the case. And of course, it is always best to talk and to meet and to try to resolve differences rather than to ignore and cancel things.
Let's talk about the current state of trade relations between China and the EU following this summit. Where would you characterize them? And also, what are some of the more critical elements that are floating around out there? Clearly, China wants more EVs to go to the EU.
Yeah, and the EU is concerned that China will swamp the European market with EV vehicles, but also with many other products. The EU keeps talking about Chinese overcapacity, meaning that the Chinese produce many more products than they can possibly sell in the domestic market, and also globally they have difficulties in selling their products. And the European market is the largest single market in the world, and that is, of course, a very attractive market to sell Chinese products into. The Europeans are concerned that it will bankrupt their own companies, that they will lose the capacity to produce EV vehicles, for example, and therefore they are not prepared to tolerate being swamped, as they say, by, for example, Chinese EV vehicles. But they also complain about the trade deficit with China. It's over $300 billion this year, and they complain about a lack of market access to China and many other issues. Most of these issues have been around for many years, but they still have not been resolved. So the EU keeps saying about, or keeps talking about promise fatigue. They say the Chinese don't promise a lot, but then they don't do what they promise to do. And they want now to overcome that and find a permanent solution.
Yeah. Now, when you talk about overcapacity, I know China has pushed back and said the EU basically has a convenient memory when the fact that they the shoe was on the other foot some time back. But moving ahead, I want to talk about Donald Trump. He's an ocean away, yet his policies of tariff, and undoing the trade imbalance. How is that affecting these negotiations going on? And do you find it odd in any way that his name is still in the circling those discussions as well?
Well, in a way, you know, Donald Trump is an elephant in the room. Everyone knows that the whole global trading relationship among all countries has been severely undermined and disrupted by Donald Trump's tariff policy. So there are serious Chinese-US difficulties, but also serious EU-US difficulties. But many people, many analysts have argued that the difficulties between the United States and the European Union would lead to closer relations between the European Union and China. While that theoretically could be the case, but there are so many difficulties which need to be overcome between China and the EU as well, that we haven't really noticed that EU-Chinese relations have become warmer because of Donald Trump. And the EU, of course, wants to have good relationships with both the United States and China, but they find themselves in very difficult waters with both countries, and not just regarding trade relations, but also regarding security and geopolitical relations. And that applies to the United States and Donald Trump, but also to China. And here, of course, the EU criticizes Chinese closeness to Russia and Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. And all these issues have been discussed at the summit, but I don't think that they could be overcome. There was an agreement, a communique was signed regarding climate change. And here, of course, both sides can cooperate and are quite prepared to cooperate. And that is probably one of the very few issues at the moment where real cooperation and real agreement can be found.
You know, I want to talk about China's trade maturing, because it's gone from making what many considered poor quality items to now making some of the best high tech, one of the leaders in AI, as we mentioned, their EVs, their lithium batteries. To what degree has that affected trade? And what steps do you think both sides are working on to ensure that this continued economic cooperation goes on despite these tensions?
Yes, the EU is always calling for the opening up of the Chinese market, and says the EU market is open to China and they can trade as they wish, which does not apply, the EU says, regarding EU producers in China. So they want to intensify their trading relationship with China, but the maturity, the innovativeness of Chinese products is causing problems for European producers. In a way, you can say that the competition is heating up because China has become better in terms of technology, in terms of innovation. And, you know, only 50 years ago, China was hardly capable to produce any car. Now they are leader among EV vehicles. This is quite a step, and the EU realizes that. And there's no desire to contain China or to decouple from China, but they're calling for fair market practices. And they say the European producers must also have a chance on the Chinese market. And of course, Chinese products should have a chance on the European market. And the EU always claims that the European market is much more open than the Chinese market is to European producers. These are some of the issues, and they had to be hammered out at that summit today. And I think, you know, real solutions couldn't be found. But the next stages, of course, mean negotiations will continue at the working level, away from the limelight. And perhaps that is actually quite good, because it is seldom that leading politicians can find a compromise while discussing things really in front of the media, in the limelight.
Klaus Larres, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you for your insight.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.